Hello and welcome to the PreSales Podcast. It's your host and PreSales Collective General Manager, Chris Mabry. Today, I'm speaking with Ross Rotherham, Leadership Coach, PreSales Leader, Holistic Medicine Practitioner, and much, much more. The title for today's episode is Coaching for PreSales Leaders, where we dive into Ross's incredible journey from holistic medicine all the way to coaching. We define and differentiate the coaching and mentoring terms. We unpack different styles and uses of coaching, provide tips to leaders to enhance their coaching with their teams. We also unpack the concepts of curious communication, conscious listening, effective questioning, and intentional presence. We're barely scratching the surface here on Ross's journey and how his craft can give us an unbelievable advantage in our business conversations and in life. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Thank you for tuning in. Ross Rotherham, welcome to the PreSales Podcast.
Yeah, hey Chris, great to be here. Thank you.
And you've been involved in PreSales Collective for many years. Your journey is a winding path, and I'm super happy to unpack it. And I'm so glad to finally have you on the podcast as a guest. Can you tell us about something that's exciting or new happening in your world?
Probably the thing that is most exciting that I'm working on at the moment is a big transformation project. And it's not specific to pre-sales, and I'll talk about that. It's a leadership transformation project. So we're in a large organization in Australia. We're taking 5,500 leaders through a leadership training program. So the same content from the CEO all the way to team leads. And it's genuinely making cultural change within that organization. So it's been running for a little over 3 years. We're in the last 6 months of that now. That's something that I'm working on at the moment that I'm really enjoying and just being involved, but also seeing incredible results when you go across that level of consistency in an org.
Wow. So 3-year project that you're wrapping up. What are you going to do to celebrate?
Find out what the next project is. And to be clear, I wasn't actually involved right at the beginning. So I've been in that for the last 18 months. But I've had the opportunity to run a dozen workshops and about 200 what we call coaching circles, where we have groups of 5 or 6 people learning about coaching as a leader in small groups together and observing feedback and all of that. Yeah, it's been great.
To think that you started in pre-sales and you landed doing this, I have to ask, tell us about your story. So for anybody in the audience who's thinking, or who's in a current pre-sales role thinking, wow, how did pre-sales go into coaching and everything that you're doing now? So just walk us through that real quick.
So you say I started in pre-sales. I actually started in alternative medicine. So it's been a very winding path. So in terms of the pre-sales piece, I was living in New York City with my wife, and we were running clinics over there and working in integrated medical centers. And we always wanted to come back to Australia. And I said one day, look, I should get a job with a transferable salary. And I used to program back in high school. Maybe I could go and do that, right? And this was in 1999, when it was just kicking off like crazy over there. And so I went a 3-month full-time sysadmin and programming course and then just hustled. And the Australian community was about 15,000 strong at that point. So I hustled through there, finding anyone in tech, and I landed myself in a startup coding front ends of custom CRMs for the pharmaceutical industry. So I did that for a little while. I was at that organization for 8 years, as it turned out, but I started coding. And I will say, as a quick aside, the day I finished coding was a good day for the world. I was not a good coder. But, I don't think there's any of my code running anywhere in the world anymore. I was working in that. I was the primary pre-sales person. It was a really small organization. We were 30 at our peak. So I worked alongside the CEO, and we were going in and selling to Procter & Gamble, Bristol Myers Squibb, GSK, like big organizations. And why would we work with someone small like you? So, well, we can be nimble in ways that the other players can't. And that was part of our catch at the time. But we brought on 50 pharma companies, or pharma and life science, in my time there. And it was a great experience. And then in terms of going into leadership, the CEO came to me one day, and my recollection of it, he might describe it differently, but the development team, you know them all pretty well, right? It's like, yeah, I think so. Well, there's a mass resignation being threatened. Can you kind of help with bringing them back on board? So I jumped on a plane. They were in Switzerland and went over and sat down and worked with them. And we did manage to retain everyone except for one. And that was kind of my beginning into leadership. And I ended up not long after that running the whole technical side of that organisation, from support, pre-sales, integrations, product development, all of that. Then moved back to Australia, went back from what was a high-level role in a startup back to an individual contributor at Akamai as an SE, and then worked my way up as an SE at Akamai through to eventually senior director running the pre-sales organisation for Asia Pacific. So 50 people doing business in 25 cities in 7 languages, which was a fascinating experience. And then after that, I've now gone into coaching and facilitation, which largely is with technology leaders. But as I gave that other example, it's not all with technology leaders.
You said it was going long, but that's a long story and there's many different turns to it. So I don't blame you at all.
Yeah.
I've really consumed your content as a coach. Frankly, I didn't know a lot of those bits and pieces until you and I started working together. But I'm sure the culmination of all that learning and having to fly over there and fix the team up and get people on board, and then your background of medicine and practice with people and bodies helps you conversate, helps you relate maybe. But I've noticed that there's this interesting term you use around debunking and mentor coach. So I want to kind of like define some terms and understand what you mean by that. So if we can take a turn into that part of your journey now, just kind of explain that for me and the audience.
I guess I have this sense that the way people talk about coaching and mentoring is as if it's similar or the same thing. And I get that sense from working with hundreds of leaders, with my experience when I had leaders say to me, oh, well, I'm going to coach this person or that person, or watching the Slack chat on PSC or other LinkedIn. And hopefully I'm wrong. It would be great if I'm wrong. But my sense is that people see them as quite similar things, and they're not. And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying coaching is better and mentoring is not good or anything like that. They're both critically important. And I guess my passion about this topic is that I feel if people aren't understanding kind of some of the nuances of what coaching is or can be or can provide, then there's the potential that they're missing out. I think across a career in a technology role, and we've got skills training, we've got mentoring, we've got coaching. The skills training and mentoring probably takes up the absolute vast lion's share of the time that would be the right amount of time to put in. But I think coaching offers something different, and it offers something that has the potential to create quantum leaps in people where some of the other things don't necessarily have that same impact.
I mean, almost every org I've worked in, those terms are always thrown around, mentorship program, coaching. They're kind of just thrown around as if they're the same thing. And I can't help but feel like I kind of think that they're the same thing in some ways. When I picture what coaching looks like versus mentorship, they kind of blend in my head as well. And I have this intense curiosity. So it helps, but it also hinders me sometimes because I want to go deep into that. Perhaps it would be helpful to define the two. So how do you define coaching and how do you define mentoring?
Just one quick aside that's come to mind is I was thinking about in the pre-sales community, there's been over the years a lot of talk about the naming convention for the role, and people are very passionate about that. And it's not that one's right or wrong, but that's how I feel about this. So definition. So my new favourite definition for mentoring, which I heard only very recently actually, is when a leader uses their wisdom to help others become wiser. And I really like that. And when we get into the definitions of how they're different, it's that using their wisdom to help another person. When I think about coaching, I think about the International Coaching Federation style coaching. And there's lots of different definitions, but for the purposes of this discussion, the definition I'm using is written up as partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. The difference being that if we say mentorship is about using your wisdom to help others become wiser, coaching could be connecting with the individual you're working with's wisdom to help them become wiser. It's bringing out what's already within them.
I can't help but think of the teach somebody to fish or give them a fish, but it's even more complex than that.
Yeah, I like that analogy though. I think that certainly connects with the concept really closely.
Something else I've noticed that you mentioned as you talk about like communication techniques. So coaching as a leader is a different communication technique than others. Obviously, the way you communicate and your techniques and how you walk through these processes is probably very specific, is my assumption. Walk me through that a little bit. Tell us more how that works.
One thing I would start this with is when I'm working with leaders and doing leader as coach programs, I don't think about it as trying to get them to be in a place where they're going to be a professional coach. I know people who've been coaching for 20 years who are still honing their craft, right? It's a never-ending process of improving communication. I guess I think about it more of curious communication. So getting leaders to be curious in the way they communicate on a level that's beyond what they're doing today. And what I mean by that is, I think of three pillars, right? Listening, asking, and presence. And so getting them to understand what's conscious listening, getting them to understand what's effective questioning, and getting them to understand what's intentional presence. And when you bring those three things together, it really changes the way that you hear things. It changes the way you interact with people. It changes the outcomes. There's a lot to it. So I was just going back through some notes a couple of months ago, back to my first ever professional coach training course. And day one, probably hour one, do a self-assessment. And there's a whole lot of questions, but one of them was, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 4. How good a listener are you? And I'm like, I've been leading for years. I'm fantastic at listening. So I gave myself a 4, right? And then the last 3 years I've spent learning how to listen. And going back to that point in time, I think maybe on a good day I would have given myself a 2, but probably on most days, not even that. And that was a real eye-opener for me, of just that there was a whole lot to learn about it that I just didn't even know existed.
I can't help but thinking that there's basically an entire set of knowledge under all three of those pillars you mentioned. And as I'm listening to you now, as we talk, I'm trying to practice my conscious listening, is what you called it, because I also consider myself as somebody who practices active listening, quote unquote, but probably to a degree in which maybe you just don't know what you don't know. So let's take that one pillar and then kind of dig into it a little bit more. What is conscious listening? How does it entail? And I think what I like about the way you're describing it is you're describing it as like a skill, as a technique, as a process. So walk us through that in kind of more detail.
It's absolutely a skill. One of the things about great listeners is you really know when you're being listened to. And you've had that experience of when you're genuinely being listened to, it feels good, right? Just within the listening pillar, there's a dozen different things that you could consider, right? I mean, you can get into levels of listening, beyond words, patterns, absolutes, all sorts of different things. But let's pull out 3 specific skills in listening and talk about those. And I think that will give a good example. So the first one, if we think about the concept of listening to hear versus listening to respond. And I'm sure no one who's listening to this podcast has ever done this before, but I'll speak for myself, right? It was quite common for me when I was in a conversation or a meeting or wherever with people in a place where I could be listening, where instead of listening to the content and really hearing what was going on, I would often be listening for enough for me to be prepared to make a response. And once I had that response in my mind, I wasn't listening to the content anymore. I was listening for a place in the conversation to insert my response. And when you're doing that, you're not hearing what's going on from the point you've decided what your response is going to be. Now, my particular brand of that had an additional flavor, which was I also consider myself a bit of a joker. So I would often be listening for, where's the witty comment that I can insert into this conversation or meeting, right? So not only was I not listening, but I was also preparing to make a comment in the meeting that would derail it for everybody else. And it went over well. People enjoyed it, and being witty is fun. But in retrospect, I'm thinking about that ability now to notice, am I actually paying attention? One of the maestros of listening, another Aussie called Oscar Trimboli, he's someone, if you're interested in listening, you should check out. He's got a book, How to Listen. in his book, one of the things he says is the difference between an average listener and a great listener is not that a great listener doesn't get distracted by that inner dialogue, but a great listener notices and brings themselves back to listening again quickly. We all have that inner dialogue. We've all got that distraction going on. But so that concept of listening to hear, and to achieve that, you need to be aware of listening to self. So you've got to be conscious of what your inner dialogue is saying. Is it bringing you on track? Is it taking you off track? Is it being helpful? I mean, that's a whole other discussion in itself of connecting with your inner dialogue. So that's one skill. How does that land for you, Chris?
Well, I feel myself doing it now. And I'm sure to our listeners listening, they're going, oh yeah, I'm not listening. You can pull yourself in and out of it. And I once watched a documentary with Eckhart Tolle, and he was talking about being present and how you basically come into presence and then you come back and you're never there the whole time. And so as I listen to you explain it, I'm kind of practicing that process. And it's hard to imagine being able to do it without consciously paying attention to it. And I guess I'm using the word conscious listening. That was on accident, but that's how it feels to me.
Yeah, that being present, I think, is a great term to use there. Another way to think might be about metacognition. So being able to actually step outside and observe our own thoughts becomes really important in being able to catch that. So that's one skill, and that's a lifetime of learning for all of us just in that one, right? So let's take a second skill. And this comes from some studies back in the 70s. And again, I was introduced to this concept by Oscar. And a technical audience generally resonates well with this. We speak at roughly 125 to 140 words a minute as humans. We think at about 900 words a minute, and we listen at about 400 words a minute. If you think about those differences, it can give you an enormous amount of information about how you do or don't listen, right? And there can be things in there of if someone's thinking at 900 words a minute and speaking at 125, what you're hearing from them is only about 15% of what's going on in their mind, right? So from a listening perspective, it can be just the action of asking them for more information about that thing, whatever it is they're talking about. There's more in there than what you've heard. That can be one piece of it. Another piece can be if someone's speaking to you at 125 words a minute and you're listening at 400, there's quite a lot of space in there for you to add your own dialogue in.
Right.
Right. And I mean, there's a lot more that we could talk about with that. But just that concept, for me, understanding just that there's a difference between the speeds of how people are speaking and what we're consuming and our own internal dialogue and so on was extremely helpful, and helpful for that first concept that we talked about earlier as well. How does that one land for you, Chris?
I wonder, do you see that changing with the way we consume content? I'm thinking of social media, quick clips, those really sped up clips and things like that. Do you see this changing, or is that something that doesn't change and we're just kind of trying to hack our own ability to keep up with these videos and things that we're just bombarded with all the time?
I've never thought about that question. The thing that jumped to mind, we've spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving to where we're at now. So I think the concept of those numbers that I gave probably won't change that quickly, but the way that technology interacts with them, or we can use that understanding, might change the way that we communicate with each other. And maybe even just the thought of the clips that are sped up and that sort of thing, if people are aware that you can consume it at twice the rate that it's normally spoken at, then why wouldn't they put it out that quickly, right? If you're going to get the same level of understanding.
It's so true. I mean, I think a lot of the individuals listening to us who have, listened to their recorded demos and listened to other things. If you lead teams, you listen to a lot of demos, etc. You always like to exit because you know that you can make up some time there. And because we're on the topic of pre-sales and I'm thinking of conscious listening and I'm thinking of discovery, how does listening consciously matter as a pre-sales leader or an individual contributor? I know that if I'm actively and consciously listening to my prospect, I'm obviously going to know more about their pain points and how to structure my demonstration. But I also know that I was somebody who was given 8-10 demos a day, and you hear that one thing and you go, I know what I'm going to show next. So how do you find that line and why does it matter?
I think you hit the nail on the head with, I know what I'm going to show next. For me, the difference is between assumption and understanding. If you're genuinely listening, then the number of assumptions will be reduced, that you're going to be connecting in with people in a way where, and this would be getting into some of the questioning area, but connecting in with people in a way where you draw out, why does it matter to them? What's their genuine interest there? What's underneath what they're saying to you? What's the full story? How do all the different people in the room interconnect with each other? Like a whole lot of information that's much more beyond the demo. And it might be just one little gem in there that gives you the key to connecting fully with whoever the person is, the buyer, the customer, whoever it is. From a leadership perspective, the listening piece, there's a lot of information out there about empowerment, belonging, inclusivity, all of those things. But then there's also more tactical stuff around getting a genuine understanding about where people want to go with their careers and their career paths and that sort of thing. Having a genuine listening rather than making assumptions about where they want to get to can be super helpful for where that person ends up, what their life satisfaction is going to be, and those sorts of things. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah. It is easy, I think, in somebody who has, reached a leadership role or maybe management and leadership, which are two different things, where their goals, and they assume everyone around them wants the same thing. Why wouldn't you? I learned that early on as like my first management role was, oh, wow, not everybody wants to do this. It's a silly mistake. Yes. I think a lot of us make when you first get that frontline management role, and then you step back and think, these are people's lives, and I really have to understand where they want to go. And I have to do that by being curious, and I have to do that by inquiring, and it doesn't all happen at once. To me, this ties back to that mentor versus coach concept. And so we just went down one pillar. I feel like there's a school of thought for each three. So let's leave that one pillar as it is.
Absolutely.
Let's tie this back to the coach versus the mentorship concept where we started. And how does that apply to those two different things?
I want to really reiterate something I said at the beginning, which is I'm absolutely not saying that coaching is better than mentoring, right? Or vice versa. Both of them are critically important. How it ties back to that is spending time on even just the listening part. Spending time on that listening pillar will be a game changer in your level of understanding about the people in your team, will be a game changer in your level of understanding of the customer, what they care about. It will make your mentoring better. Like when we start out with some genuine listening and some powerful questions at the beginning of a mentoring conversation, when we get to the mentoring part, it's now going to be tied much more closely to what that person genuinely cares about and resonates with them than if we start straight into that mentoring with giving them what we think is important in the moment, giving them our answer.
I think the difference just clicked with me with what you were saying earlier. So that's super helpful. And I see it being very helpful in pre-sales, but in life too. I mean, if you're consistently listening and looking for that, I mean, if you ask those right questions in relationships, you're going to have a better direction with the answers and know what to do with them. Well, Ross, I want to switch over to the lightning round. We're going to ask you a couple of quick questions. We're going to talk about how to get a hold of you. And I feel like we barely scratched the surface in your knowledge, but I want to bring this back to solution engineering and development. So my first question for you is this: what are some of your pet peeves in solution engineering leadership development? You see a lot of it. You talk to leaders all the time.
I don't know if I'd call this a pet peeve or not, but I'm increasingly surprised by the level that people hand their development over to their organisation rather than taking the reins themselves. And certainly this is not everybody, but waiting for your development to come to you through the organisation, through the organisation's budgets, I think has the potential to limit your own development. And I would encourage people to get out and take their own development by the reins and also think beyond, I need to develop to get to what's the next role. That's good, and that'll be a part of it. But also think, what do I need in life to be genuinely satisfied? Go for some bigger questions. and land some things around those. And a coach, and there's lots of coaches out there, right? A coach can help you with thinking through those things. And for me, it was an absolute eye-opener to discover that what I genuinely wanted was quite different to what my organization necessarily wanted. And they weren't opposed, but I could take myself further by owning it.
That's a great tip and perfect segue. What drives Ross Rotherham more than money?
So number one is probably learning, lifetime learner. I think I'm probably speaking to the converted in our community, right? But absolute lifetime learner. I burn through books and podcasts and all of that. Family and connection and coaching. One of the biggest impacts for me in my coaching has been my relationship with my teenage son. It's completely changed in a very positive way. So that's been really important. And I don't know, maybe this is a function of being older now, but pursuing a sense of contentment rather than a sense of always wanting more. And I have been in that place and I loved it and I was good at it. But yeah, I think connecting with what genuinely matters to me. So one of my catchphrases is you can be successful and genuinely satisfied and happy at the same time if you put some energy towards thinking about both of those things.
Wow. And that sense should fit you like a glove, right? Your source of contentment is nobody else's. So
yeah.
What is something that most people don't know about you?
The thing that I think surprises people most when I talk to them about myself is that my original career was Chinese medicine. And I had the opportunity to do about 5,000 one-on-one clinical sessions in that world. And it was Chinese medicine, bodywork, various things, working alongside doctors for most of it. But people have trouble connecting, where do I even hook that concept, right?
Yeah.
And whereas in my head, the systems thinking that I got from holistic diagnostic methods has been absolutely integral to how I've run my life and how I think about most things. So I got a lot from that fits together very well in my head.
I can see that, the whole system mindset, just our one pillar we discussed, conscious listening. It's a part of a very big process and a very big system that you're kind of coming in and out of the whole time. I want to ask how people can get a hold of you, Ross, but also I would love for you to share, not only can they get a hold of you on a platform, but what if somebody's listening to this and they're super curious of diving deeper, they're interested in helping their teams or their self get better at what you're describing?
Connecting with me, probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn. If you connect with me through LinkedIn, I will see it. So I'll leave that as there. In terms of what I'm doing with people to help with individuals and careers and teams, so I've got a few different things going on. I do quite a bit of one-on-one coaching with technology leaders for people who are wanting to move forward in their careers, find that satisfaction, balance, and so on. I do quite a bit of work in teams where it could be around strengths profiling and identifying that. I do some programs. I do curious communication for leaders as a program, and also I think as an owner, and I think like an owner for technology leaders. So I've got a number of different things that are going on that you can see on my website, or shoot me a note on LinkedIn and I can send more information about that.
Great. And I'll include some of that in the show notes as well, so everybody knows where to go.
Right.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ross. We really appreciate it. And to the audience, thank you for joining me today on this epic adventure through the lens of Ross Rotherham. I don't know about you, but as we got into conscious listening, I felt myself really hearing him differently. It's a great way to listen on purpose. And it's a great reminder to take this into our calls with prospects, our business conversations, but most importantly in life. Coaching and mentoring are different, but both have their place. You can find Ross on LinkedIn. He has all the links you need to engage with him there. Again, we really scratched the surface of what I think Ross can provide. Thank you again, Ross, for all that you have given to PreSales Collective, PreSales Academy. We really greatly appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast. At PreSales Collective, we're all about learning, connecting, and growing. I believe investing in these three pillars will greatly increase your success and happiness at work and in life. See you next time on the PreSales Podcast.